Because I choose civility, understanding, listening, working together to get stuff done, I will leave the Senate at the end of this year.
In March, Senator Kyrsten Sinema announced that she will not be running for a second Senate term come November. Sinema had previously won the seat in 2018 as a moderate Democrat, but later left the party altogether in 2022, registering as an independent instead. Her exit in the Senate race now pulls the race in either direction. Will Arizonans choose the Democratic House Representative, Latino war veteran Ruben Gallego?
I'm Ruben Gallego. I'm running to be the Senator of Arizona. Because you deserve somebody fighting for you and fighting with you every day to make sure you have the same chance al sueño americano.
Or Republican frontrunner and news anchor Kari Lake.
Get people in there who are moms, who've led a real normal life, who want to go in and get some work done, and then come back home. I don't want people to go to D.C. forever.
In a state where Latinos make up over a third of Arizona's population, it's no question that their vote can make or break a candidate. Back in 2018, Sinema won 70% of the Latino vote, which helped her become the first Democratic senator elected to represent Arizona since 1995. 2 years later, the Latino population helped flip the historically red state to blue. President Joe Biden was elected by less than 11,000 votes in the state. But what can we expect from Latino voters in this next election? In this episode of Nationally, we'll explore how the Latino vote has shifted Arizona politics and what we might expect come November.
Welcome back to Nationally. In this limited election series podcast by Immigrantly Media, we're going to talk about the issues that matter to some of the most overlooked Democratic groups in each state. We'll explore what issues matter to these communities and why they matter. We are your hosts, Juan Diego Ramirez.
And I'm Sarah Sadwani.
And this is Nationally.
Now to politics and the fight for a key demographic in the 2024 presidential race. We're talking about Latino voters.
Biden outpaced Trump among Hispanic voters in the state by 24 points.
Hispanic voters are expected to make up about 15% of all eligible voters in the upcoming presidential election.
The Latino vote, the Hispanic voting bloc, it means different things to whichever pundit you ask. But what everyone always agree on every election is how essential it is to get the Latino vote. In states like Arizona, the Latino vote made a difference in electing Biden over Trump in the 2020 election. But let's take a step back. Before we can talk about Latinos, I think it's important that we define who Latinos actually are and why they always are grouped together. How does a demographic with 63.7 million people define themselves as individuals and as a collective? And why does drawing those distinctions matter?
When people talk about the Latino vote, they use it as a kind of umbrella term to refer to Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, Cuban Americans. The list goes on and on and on. There's not necessarily a Latino bloc, a group of Latino voters, certainly not that votes the same way.
That was Northwestern professor Geraldo Caldava on NBC News talking about the Latino vote and how it swayed the 2020 election.
Ever since Richard Nixon's re-election in 1972, the Republican presidential candidate has won about a quarter or a third of the Latino vote. Sometimes it's gone a little up, sometimes it's gone a little down. But I think what's truly curious about this moment is that I don't know that anyone would have predicted that Donald Trump would have been the Republican candidate to even expand Latino support beyond.
Back in 2016, many experts were shocked to see how Trump won 28% of the Latino vote, especially after he announced in his 2016 candidacy in a speech calling Mexicans rapists.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems. And they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some...
Trump's victory in 2016 alone should be indicative of how diverse and nuanced the Latino vote is. In fact, there are Latino voters who want stricter borders despite being immigrants themselves. And in Arizona, where Latinos make up over a third of the population, it's important to note that not every Latino thinks the same on every issue. Sarah, what are the misconceptions that some people have about the Latino vote in Arizona?
This is such a huge question, and I'm so glad that you bring this up because we constantly hear the Latino vote, the Latino vote. When we think about survey research, we are often finding that national origin actually matters a whole lot to Latinos, right? Where you come from, the country that you arrived from. And there's so many reasons for that, and we can get into that. But what research finds is that it matters in terms of their political attitudes and their behavior at the ballot box. When we conduct a survey, we typically ask people to identify themselves by their race or ethnicity. So in those big national surveys that always make headline news, people are asked, are you Black? Are you white? Are you Latino? Are you Native American? Are you Asian? But doing that conflates who people really are. So in this Latino box, we might get information that says something like 75% of Latinos support gun reform or are concerned about global warming. But that is going to mask the differences that exist based on national origin. So when we start breaking that down, when we ask in surveys, what country of origin is your family from? Were you born in a country other than the United States, or were you born in the US, right? We begin to see all of this difference and variation between Mexican Americans, between Cuban Americans, between Puerto Ricans, between Venezuelans, right? There's a lot that goes into the immigrant experience that complicates this quote unquote Latino vote. I want to point to this really important book in political science written back in 2010 from Cristina Beltran, who's a political scientist at NYU. The book is called The Trouble with Unity, Latino Politics and the Creation of Identity.
So first, the Latino vote. And one thing to remember is that while we can talk about the Latino vote, we can't talk about the Latino community. Though we do, and pundits say this all the time, and I hate that. It drives me crazy. There is no singular Latino community, and certainly no singular Latino political community. Instead, there are plural and multiple and shifting Latino communities. And I think it does a disservice to the many different forms of politics and activism and action going on to talk about them in that kind of monolithic way.
And the book offers this really nuanced critique of this idea of Latinidad, this idea that there's just this one Latino vote, or back in the early 2020s or the aughts, people kept talking about Latinos as being this sleeping giant. And she really breaks down the Latino electorate and protest politics. And she works to erase some of this conflation of who Latinos are by taking this feminist intersectional critique and really pointing to the places of difference between Latino communities.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, does country of origin matter? Well, it does, because many migrants who migrate from different countries, as they arrive, policies are enacted differently. That sometimes can affect the way they are welcomed into the country and possibly the way that they will vote in the future. From my experience, I can say that as a Mexican immigrant, I lived in the US almost 23 years undocumented.
How old were you when you came to the US?
I came when I was 10 years old. I got my residency when I was 28. That was 18 years of living in the shadows.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And thank you so much for sharing, your personal story. That helps to contextualize things so much. And certainly this is what we find in a lot of political science research, is that immigrant experience, how easy or difficult it was for you to come, the kind of community that you settle in as well, right? If you're settling into an urban area that's really liberal, or a suburban area, or a rural area that's really conservative, all of those pieces, all of that experience ultimately helps shape the perspective of that immigrant as they become civically engaged in the United States, and most certainly as they become voters themselves. And we see a lot of these differences, whether it's between Cuban Americans in Florida, many of whom began coming to the United States early on during the revolution in Cuba. And at that time, it was the highly educated Cubans that were coming. It was the middle class. And they, even today, continue to have a more conservative approach to politics, as we've seen in Florida. And if you contrast that to other communities, the story you shared of your own personal journey, it's quite different. And all of those have very real political consequences.
Among more than 2,700 eligible Latino voters, the top issues are now 1, inflation, 2, crime, and 3, gun violence. But one striking addition to this list is the issue of abortion. Of course, this is following the Supreme Court decision to overturn Roe v. Wade. Well, now
that was Morgan Radford from MSNBC discussing the shifting Latino views on abortion. As we've said, Latinos are not a monolith, and they can shift their political ideologies on all sorts of political issues. That was also something that I noticed when taking a look at the topic of abortion. Latinos are initially thought of as being conservative on the topic of abortion due to many having Catholic values which disapprove of the act altogether.
One of the questions they asked in this poll had this exact wording, quote, "No matter what my personal beliefs about abortion are, I think it is wrong to make abortion illegal and take that choice away from everyone else." So 76% of Latino voters agreed with that statement, that it's wrong to make abortion illegal, no matter their personal beliefs. But
what we're finding is that an overwhelming majority of Latinos are actually opposed to abortion bans. And there's a growing number of Latinos who actually want access to abortions. Let me break it down for you. In a recent poll from Unidos USA, they found that 72% of the Latinos that were surveyed said that it was wrong to make abortion illegal. And the reason I bring up abortion among Latinos is because it will make a huge impact this election season. Here's Democratic Arizona Governor Katie Hobbs.
It is a dark day in Arizona. Just now, the Arizona Supreme Court issued its opinion in Planned Parenthood v. Mays, upholding one of the most extreme abortion bans in the country.
In early April, the Arizona Supreme Court ruled that the state must adhere to an 1864 law that bans abortion in all cases. This centuries-old law supersedes the 2022 abortion ban that had already been put in place, which had a 15-week ban on abortion. However, it only took Governor Hobbs a matter of weeks to repeal the centuries-old measure. Arizona is one of the 25 states where citizens can change their own laws, and organizers with Arizona for Abortion Access, a coalition of reproductive rights, began mobilizing efforts for a 2024 ballot initiative.
Arizona for Abortion Access filed with the state today to get a new constitutional amendment on the ballot. The coalition needs to gather nearly 400,000 signatures to put the abortion rights question up to voters in November of next year.
My body, my choice!
More than a year.
The coalition has already exceeded the 383,923 signatures needed to put the issue on the ballot. And so the topic of abortion is most certainly going to be on the ballot come November and will drive a lot of Arizona voters to the voting booth, including the Latino voters in the state. The topic of abortion also trickles down into this senatorial race.
U.S. Senate hopefuls Democrat Ruben Gallego and Republican Kari Lake's campaign stops now centering around abortion.
Republican frontrunner Kari Lake has been shaky on the abortion topic altogether. While she initially distanced herself from the 1864 total abortion ban, saying, quote, "It was out of line with where the people of the state are," she also expressed frustration that the total ban is not being enforced. This situation is far removed from Trump, who has refused to endorse a national abortion ban, which would likely impact his electability. On the Democratic end of things, candidate Ruben Gallego was quoted saying, "Arizonans aren't dumb. They know that Kari Lake is lying and is willing to say anything she can to win and to hold power, and they will not trust her with this." I mean, there's a lot happening in Arizona. There is this huge consequential race for the Senate. Arizona is a major swing state in the presidential election. And this abortion ban, or repeal of the abortion ban, is likely to be on the ballot. The stakes are really high here in Arizona.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, abortion as a topic in Latin America, it's an interesting one because a lot of people, like as you mentioned, a lot of people think of Latinos as being Catholic and thus, being anti-abortion. But in Latin America, many countries have legalized abortion. You think about Argentina recently legalized abortion. Mexico has softened its laws on abortion. I mean, there are countries that have, banned abortion in Latin America, but those are countries with smaller populations. You think of the bigger countries themselves. Again, Mexico being one of them, even Brazil.
And I think politically here in the United States, abortion has been this huge issue ever since that Dobbs ruling that overturned Roe v. Wade. In 2022, we saw abortion on the ballot, and Democrats doubled down on that message that Republicans were being too harsh on abortion. And we saw things moving, in states like California and Vermont, where you might expect it to move forward, but also in swing states like Michigan, as well as defeating measures having abortion bans in red states like Kansas, Kentucky, and Montana. Republican voters are saying this is going way too far. So this abortion issue has actually been a winner for Democrats, and no doubt Kari Lake and Trump are really nervous about it. And that's why Trump won't move forward with a national abortion ban, because he knows that it is a losing issue. But I think an issue that he sees as a winning issue for Trump is actually immigration, which plays a big role in Arizona as well.
In 2016, President Trump won Arizonans' vote, but in 2020, Arizona went to Joe Biden.
Our data expert Garrett Archer combing through the numbers to see how our state's votes have changed.
Soon after the election's results were announced, Joe Biden's campaign credited its success in Arizona to the immigrant rights and grassroots organizations that have been mobilizing Latinos for nearly 2 decades. Many of our listeners might already be familiar with Arizona's anti-immigrant policies, more specifically SB 1070. It's what many call the Show Me Your Papers law. SB 1070 was a controversial 2010 Arizona law that was at the time the strictest anti-immigration law in the nation. It allowed police to detain anyone suspected of entering the country illegally and required immigrants to carry documents at all times. The overall issue with this law was that it opened the case for legalized racial profiling.
From looking at someone, you can't tell if they're undocumented or not. So although this bill was targeted to people that were undocumented in this country, my friends who were citizens, my brother who's a citizen, they felt attacked over the way they looked. And that's what I guess most people didn't get about this bill. That's the underlying racist tone underneath it. We had to fear.
I remember this time so well. I actually used to work in immigrant rights, and I mean, every legal organization from the ACLU to immigrant rights groups were horrified by this law. So many lawsuits filed against it, and it was a huge issue, including the Obama administration and the Justice Department brought a lawsuit against the state of Arizona.
Tuesday, the Obama administration filed the biggest protest yet, suing the state. The federal lawsuit claims Arizona crossed a constitutional line. The guarantees federal law supersedes state law. The suit argues that a patchwork of state and local policies would disrupt federal immigration enforcement.
And I mean, this was headline news at the time because this law was just so strict and just seemed like such a violation. Anyone driving down the street, I mean, if you are not white, essentially, could be stopped and asked to show proof that you are allowed to be in the United States.
Yeah, I remember that time, and it was all eyes on Arizona. Such a strange time. The scars of SB 1070 lingered on. Like many Latinos who were too young to vote then still remember the fear around the law. Gallego, who's now leading the Senate race, tweeted, "The children of SB 1070 10 years later grew to change Arizona. You tried to bury us, you didn't know we were seeds, and we would grow to fight for Arizona." So people behind the 2020 Democratic win are actually the children or teens who grew up watching their immigrant parents or family members be disproportionately targeted by police and policies like SB 1070. But does it mean that Arizona Latinos lean more to the left when it comes to immigration?
There's this common misconception, not unlike with abortion, that many Latinos don't want stricter border or immigration laws. But it's important to remember that at the end of the day, Arizona is still a border state. And polling shows that about 1/3 of Latinos in Arizona actually want to increase border security. It's similar to what we're seeing in Texas, where many Latinos, predominantly of Mexican descent, hold more conservative Republican values when it comes to immigration. So there's a paradox between the impact of SB 1070 and how some Latinos actually feel about immigration. And it seems like many Arizona Latinos want to increase border security, but also don't wish to be singled out by the color of their skin, which is essentially what SB 1070 did.
Yeah, in other words, these issues are complex. Just because someone wants more border security doesn't mean that they want rules that discriminate against them. But as we've seen during Trump's first campaign season, immigration is often a racialized topic. If Trump is painting broad strokes about who is coming across the border, then policies addressing border security can often bleed into racist policies, as we've seen with SB 1070 and the new Texas law, SB 4.
And I want to also point to some of the history of California as well, because back in 1994, a somewhat different law was passed in California, Prop 187. Prop 187 wasn't a show me your papers law. It was designed to deny social services to undocumented immigrants. But what it set off were mass protests, especially of young people. A lot of research has looked at the impact of Prop 187 on California politics, because since then, today, when we look at the Latino caucus within our state legislature, for example, so many of them, of the elected members to the state legislature, were those students, were those young people who participated in those protests, who saw these anti-immigrant laws and stood up and did something about them. This is exactly what's happening in Arizona today. They were activated by this very anti-immigrant law that was passed, and they are changing the shape of Arizona politics forever. But to get back to your specific question, I don't think that necessarily means open the borders and completely change our immigration politics. What I hear from Gallego as a Senate candidate is a common sense approach, saying we can have immigration and treat people humanely, and immigrants are an important part of the United States and an important part of our economy and of our communities. But we can also be a nation of law and order, and we can uphold the laws of the border as well. And so I really see him kind of taking that moderate approach in comparison to some of the far left components. And I think that's right, because that's going to also work, presumably, with populations that feel a little bit more uncomfortable with the amount of immigrants that are coming over, especially as Trump and Kari Lake and the Republican Party advance this narrative that immigration is a real problem and we have to do something about it, or that we have to be tough on immigration. We've talked about immigration, which is an issue that we see Republicans really pushing forward. We've talked about abortion, which we know is an issue that Democrats are advancing. Kamala Harris is out on the campaign trail talking about abortion all the time. And we know the impact that Latinos in Arizona can have on these presidential elections, even if by a small margin of 11,000 votes, which is all it took to give way for a Biden victory back in 2020. But can we expect the same outcome for the Senate race? Now that Kyrsten Sinema is out of the race, Arizonans are due for a heated battle for a seat that has historically gone to a Republican candidate.
We know what the matchup will be in Arizona's key Senate race this year. It will be hard-right Republican Kari Lake, a bona fide Trump sycophant, election denier, against the Democrat Congressman Ruben Gallego, an Iraq War veteran.
At the start of this year, before Sinema had announced her leaving the race, Gallego tweeted, and I quote, 33% of Arizonans are Latino. 33% of Arizonans have yet to see someone like themselves represent them in the Senate. But will Gallego's Latino identity play a role in his electability? He's set to run against Kari Lake, a former gubernatorial candidate who lost to the current governor in a tight race, but insists that that election was stolen from her. She's also invested in the big lie that the 2020 presidential election was stolen from President Trump.
You talked about the 2020 election and saying that it's stolen. Do you really believe the 2020 election was stolen?
Yes, absolutely. I'm not the only one who believes it. The majority of Americans believe it. Unfortunately, the media refuses to cover it. We had a million ways to cheat, and they used each and every one of them.
Lake was formerly a strong proponent of draining the swamp and disrupting the establishment, but now says she would work with any senator if she were elected. She's also shifted her views on abortion. The two candidates are neck and neck, with Gallego leading in the polls, but only by a tiny margin. So what will it come down to in November? Experts are saying it's abortion. But JD, I don't know. I think immigration is going to continue to be at play here. And it'll be interesting to see both how Latinos, but also non-Latinos in Arizona, whether that's, white Arizonans, Asian Americans, Black Arizonans, how immigration plays out for them as well, and how they view Gallego being Latino if his message of a stricter border policies is actually going to work.
Yeah, I mean, although abortion has been a point of contention in recent months, I think the red meat for any border state, it's always going to be immigration.
Immigration, abortion, I completely agree with you on that. And let's not also forget that this is all looming with the presidential election that no one's very excited about, right? We've seen Trump and Biden 4 years ago. We see the matchup today, and so much is going to be at stake, especially here in Arizona. And I would love to hear, if we have listeners from Arizona, what kind of organizing are you seeing in a presidential election year, and especially with a Senate election as well? Let us know what you're seeing on the ground, and especially what kinds of targeting mechanisms are being used specifically for the Latino voters in Arizona.
Thank you again, and thanks for listening to this episode of Nationally Podcast, brought to you by Immigrantly Media. We hope you like this episode. Nationally releases weekly on Thursdays on all streaming platforms. If you have thoughts you'd like to share with us, please email them to info@immigrantlypod.com. You can reach me at JUANDR47 on X and on Instagram.
And I'm at Sarah Sadwani on all of the socials. Nationally is produced by Sadia Khan and Shay Yu. This episode is written by Andrea Flores, research assistant from Nicholas Black. Our sound designer and editor is Steve Martin. The Nationally theme music is by Simon Hutchinson. Additional music is by Epidemic Sound. Make sure to join us next week as we explore Georgia and the South Asian vote that matters.